The hegemony fell on a Tuesday. I know that because my log still kept Earth-standard chronometric sync, a detail I would not have thought twice about before the Conclave's final offensive, and one I have thought about nearly every day since. The Theron Third Expeditionary Fleet, 11 capital ships and 42 escorts, ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force at 14:17 Accord Universal on what humans would call a Tuesday afternoon. The Conclave's Hammer fleet broke our formation in the Karathsev corridor in a little over 9 hours. We had been told to hold the corridor for 3 days. 3 days was what the hegemony's Strategic Continuance Bureau had calculated. They were wrong by 2 days, 15 hours, and approximately 1,100 lives. My name is Sorath Thar. I held the rank of Fleet Commander, 3rd Expeditionary, Theron Hegemonic Navy. I say held because by the time the last of the Conclave's strike wings disengaged and left us burning in the corridor, there was no hegemonic navy to hold rank in. There was no hegemony. The government on Thar-Rorath had capitulated 6 hours before the battle ended. We received the surrender communique while the portside hull of my flagship, the Ascendant Resolve, was still venting atmosphere from a breach the size of a cargo bay. I did not read the communique immediately. I was busy. We had wounded in every corridor. The ship's medical bay had been destroyed in the second wave. The Conclave's precision torpedoes had targeted it specifically, which told me something about how thoroughly they had mapped our hull layout before the engagement. Our chief surgeon, Orath Kale, was dead. 41 of his staff were dead. The surviving medical personnel, 11 of them, 3 of whom were wounded themselves, had set up a triage station in the main hangar bay using cargo pallets and hull sealant as operating tables. The lights in the hangar flickered every 9 seconds as the secondary power grid tried to compensate for the loss of the primary. I remember that flicker. 9 seconds of light, 1 second of dark, 9 seconds of light, 1 second of dark. It gave the hangar the quality of a place that was trying to stay awake and failing. I walked the hangar at 1540. The wounded lay in rows. Theron officers do not cry out when they are injured. It is a point of training and of deep cultural pride, the silence under duress that we are taught from the age of 5. But they breathe. In that hangar I could hear them breathing, 219 of them, and the rhythm of it was the sound of a species trying to hold itself together through will alone. Ash-pale faces paler than usual, the silver white of our skin drained to a flat, matte gray that meant pain, meant blood loss, meant the body redirecting everything inward. I knew the color. I wore it myself. A compression bandage around my left thigh where a console fragment had opened the muscle, and a chemical burn across the back of my right hand where a coolant line had ruptured. Minor. I could walk. Most of the people in that hangar could not. Subcommander Valeketh found me at 16:00 and told me we had 4 ships still functional enough to maintain life support. The Ascendant Resolve, the heavy cruiser Pale Vigil, the patrol frigate Stillwater, and the courier vessel Ninth Threshold, which was the smallest ship in the fleet and now, somehow, the least damaged. Everything else was either destroyed, venting, or had been boarded and captured by the Conclave's marine contingents during the engagement. 42 escorts and 7 capital ships gone. Their crews either dead, captured, or drifting in emergency pods that no one was collecting. I asked Valeketh how many souls we had across the 4 surviving vessels. She looked at her datapad. She looked at me. She said, 2,214 Fleet Commander, 1,106 are wounded, 309 are critical. I said, and the dead? Still aboard, she said. We have not had time to, the protocols require. Leave them aboard, I said. We will attend to them when we can. That was the first decision I made as the commander of a dead navy. Leave the dead where they lay because the living needed the hands that would have moved them. I should explain the Theron to you, because what happened next will make no sense without it. We are a military species. Not in the way that some species romanticize warfare, building songs and epics around it. We are military the way a river is wet. Our civilization was organized around the hegemony's command structure the way a tree is organized around its trunk. Everything branched from it: governance, commerce, medicine, education, family law. Our ranks were our names. Our fleet was our address. When I introduced myself as Fleet Commander Sorath Thar, the rank was not a title I wore over my identity. It was my identity. Without the hegemony, I was a woman with a rank that referred to nothing, standing on a ship that belonged to a government that no longer existed, commanding officers who served a chain of command that ended, as of 6 hours ago, in a signed capitulation document transmitted from a capital that was now under conclave occupation. Our skin is silver white when we are well. It grays when we are not. Pain pulls the pigment inward, diverts it the way the body diverts blood from the extremities under shock. In the hangar bay, where 1,100 of my people lay on cargo pallets, the color of the room was a flat, chalky gray that had nothing to do with the lighting. It was us. It was the color of a species in pain, and you could read the severity by the shade: pale ash for moderate injury, matte slate for blood loss, near white for the ones who were close to the end. I learned to read the color the way Eilif Von read vital signs, and I hated that I learned it, and I was grateful that I could, because it meant I could walk the rows and know without asking who was stable and who was not. We had not always been in this position. 18 months earlier, the Theran hegemony had been the fourth largest military power in the Inner Accord. We had a seat on the Security Directorate. We had trade agreements with 9 member states. We had, in 4 separate votes over the preceding decade, blocked expansions to the Accord's humanitarian aid framework on the grounds that it would be exploited by lesser powers seeking to circumvent immigration controls. I sat in the gallery during one of those votes, the third one, when the Velmarine delegation had proposed a universal distress response mandate that would have required all signatories to render aid regardless of political status. Our delegate had spoken for 11 minutes about the dangers of moral hazard and the importance of maintaining structural incentives for self-sufficiency. The vote failed 12-9, with the Theran delegation casting the deciding vote against. I remember the Velmarine ambassador's face after the vote. She was a large, pale being with wide cranial plates and eyes that held light the way water holds depth. She looked at our delegate the way you look at someone who has said something true about themselves without realizing it. We were, in the language the Inner Accord would use 12 hours later, hostile remnants. That phrase arrived at 02:30 the following morning. I had been awake for 29 hours. Vale Keth had been monitoring the Accord's emergency channels since the battle ended, transmitting our distress on the standard frequencies: 4 damaged vessels, 2,200 souls, 1,100 wounded, requesting immediate humanitarian assistance, any vessel, any flag. The Accord's relay network had acknowledged receipt of the signal 6 times. No response had followed any of them. At 02:30, the Accord Sector Coordination Bureau transmitted a general notice on the diplomatic channel. Non-Intervention Order 1174, authorized by emergency vote of the Inner Council, classified all surviving Theran military assets in the Karathsev corridor as hostile remnants of a dissolved belligerent state. Under the order, no Accord signatory was permitted to render aid, provide fuel, accept docking requests, or engage in any material exchange with Theran military vessels or personnel until the Conclave's post-conflict adjudication process had concluded. The adjudication process, according to the order's annex, was expected to take between 14 and 22 months. Vale Keth brought me the text on a datapad. I read it standing in the corridor outside the hangar, where the 9-second flicker had finally stabilized into a steady dim glow that was somehow worse. I read it twice. I handed the datapad back to her. "How much atmosphere do we have?" I asked. At current consumption, the Resolve and the Pale Vigil can sustain for 11 days. Stillwater, 8. The ninth threshold, perhaps 15, she has fewer souls aboard. Water, 7 days across the group, if we ration to survival minimum. Medical supplies. We ran out of broad-spectrum coagulant 4 hours ago. We are improvising. Subsurgeon Eilith Vaughn is using hull sealant compound as a wound adhesive on the less critical cases. She paused. It is holding. Hull sealant on open wounds. The kind of improvisation that tells you everything about where you are. I transmitted our distress signal again at 0300, and again at 0600, and again at 0900. At 1200 I transmitted it in clear, unencrypted on every frequency we could reach: accord channels, commercial bands, deep range survey frequencies, even the old hegemonic naval reserve channels that no one had used in decades. I did not plead. I stated facts. 4 vessels, 2,200 souls, wounded, dying. Requesting assistance. Any vessel, any flag, any terms. No one answered. At 14:00, Vailketh intercepted a commercial shipping advisory from the Accord's Kareth Sector Traffic Authority. It warned all civilian and merchant vessels to avoid the Karath-Sev corridor due to the presence of hostile remnant assets. It gave our approximate coordinates, not as a rescue location, as a hazard. We were a navigation warning. On the second day, the daily rhythm of the dying ships established itself, not deliberately, but inevitably the way routines form when the alternative is chaos. At 0600, Eilith Vaughn's surviving medical staff conducted rounds in the hangar, checking wounds, changing the dressings they could change, marking the cases they could no longer help. At 0800, the water ration was distributed, 300 milliliters per person, measured in engineering beakers because the medical dispensing units had been destroyed. At 10:00, I walked the hangar. I did this every day, all 6 days without exception. I walked every row. I stopped at every pallet. I could not treat anyone. I could not offer anything except my presence, which was the only thing I had left that was not rationed, and so I gave it. At 12:00, the distress signal. At 14:00, the silence. At 16:00, the power management review, Vailketh and her engineering team tracking the steady, predictable decline of our reserves, the way a family watches a candle burn down. The Pale Vigil's Compartment 3 flooded with coolant from a ruptured secondary loop on the second night. 27 wounded had to be moved in 40 minutes by people who were themselves wounded, through corridors lit by emergency strips, to a cargo space that had not been cleaned since the battle. We lost 2 people in the move, not to the coolant, to the exertion. Their injuries were stable when we started. They were not stable when we finished. One of them, Lieutenant Commander Oreth Vel, who had served under me for 9 years and who had once declined a transfer to the hegemony's diplomatic service because she said she preferred honest work, died at 03:40 with her hand on the deck plating and her eyes open and her breathing just stopping, the way a sentence stops when the speaker has nothing left to say. I want to be precise about what that silence felt like because I have been asked about it many times since, and I have never been satisfied with my own answers. It was not dramatic. It was not the ringing, cinematic void that the historians like to describe. It was administrative. It was the sound of a galaxy that had looked at a column of numbers, our numbers, our wounded, our dead, our remaining air, and decided that the numbers did not add up to an obligation. We were not refugees. We were not civilians. We were hostile remnants, a legal category that meant we had no claim on anyone's conscience. The silence was a filing decision. Someone somewhere had put our distress signal in the wrong folder, and the folder had been closed. On the third day, Subsurgeon Eilith Vaughn lost her first patient to a wound that would have been treatable with standard field supplies. Officer Cadet Thurin Saul, 19 years old, who had taken a piece of hull plating through his abdomen during the second wave. Eilif Von had kept him stable for 51 hours with improvised clamps and a blood volume expander she had synthesized from the ship's emergency ration stock. At 09:14 on the third day, the expander failed. Thurensal's body did not have enough left to compensate. He died in the hangar bay on a cargo pallet, under the steady dim glow, with Eilif Von's hands still on his chest. She lost 4 more that day, 2 the next. I stopped counting on the 5th day, not because I did not care, because the count had become a weight I could feel in my spine, and if I kept carrying it, I would not be able to walk the hangar, and if I stopped walking the hangar, the people lying in those rows would know that their commander had given up, and I was not willing to let them know that. Not yet. Not while any of them were still breathing. On the 6th day, the comm station on the Ascendant resolves bridge, a station that had been silent for 5 days, except for the automated acknowledgement pings from Accord relay buoys that no one was reading, chimed. Vale Keth was on the bridge. I was in the hangar changing a dressing on a lieutenant's arm. Vale Keth's voice came through the internal channel, and there was something in it I had not heard in 6 days. Not hope, something smaller than hope, something more careful. Fleet Commander, we have an incoming transmission. Single vessel, bearing 074, range approximately 40,000 kilometers and closing. I set down the dressing, Accord vessel. Negative, the transponder reads a pause. The transponder reads as Earth Registry, Civilian, Survey and Humanitarian Tender, Classification ECS, Vessel Designation Harwell. I did not know what to do with that information. Earth was not an Accord signatory. Earth was not a conclave member. Earth, as far as the Theran hegemonic Navy's intelligence databases were concerned, was a mid-tier industrial world on the far side of the Orion Transit Corridor that had achieved faster-than-light capability approximately 40 standard years ago, and had since established a modest commercial presence in 3 Accord trade zones. We had no diplomatic relations with Earth. We had no trade agreements with Earth. We had, to my knowledge, never spoken to Earth. They were simply not a factor in any calculation the hegemony had ever made. Are they hailing us? I asked. Yes, open frequency, standard distress response protocol. They are another pause. They are requesting permission to approach and render assistance. I stood up. The lieutenant whose arm I had been dressing looked at me. Everyone in the hangar within earshot, and in that silence, earshot was the entire bay, looked at me. I could feel the weight of their attention. 204 pairs of eyes, ash-pale faces, the flat gray of pain and exhaustion. Grant permission, I said. The ECS Harwell came alongside the Ascendant Resolve at 11:40 on the 6th day. I watched it through the bridge viewport as it maneuvered into position, and the first thing I noticed was how small it was. Not small in a symbolic way, small in the way that matters when you are thinking about hull volume and cargo capacity, and how many wounded it could possibly take aboard. The Harwell was perhaps 1/3 the length of the Resolve. It was built like a work vessel, a broad, flat hull with modular hardpoints, and a high bridge section that looked like it had been designed by someone who cared about visibility and not at all about aesthetics. The hull was a dull blue-gray. No markings except the registry number and the letters ECS in white paint that had faded in places. There was a dent in the port quarter that looked old, the kind of ship that worked for a living. 22 crew. That was what Captain Lena Vasic told me when she came aboard 40 minutes later. She came through the Resolve's portside docking collar with 2 people behind her, a man carrying a medical case, and a woman carrying a portable atmospheric analyzer. Vasic herself carried nothing but a datapad and a canteen. She was shorter than I expected, shorter than me, and I am not tall by Theran standards. Brown hair pulled back, lines on her face that said she had spent a long time in places that were not comfortable. Her uniform, if it was a uniform, was a dark blue coverall with the ECS patch on the shoulder and a name tape on the chest. She looked like a mechanic. She looked like someone who fixed things. "Fleet Commander Sora Thar," she said. "Yes." "Captain Lena Vasic, ECS Harwell. We picked up your distress signal on the long-range survey band 4 days ago. Took us a while to get here. We were inbound from the Vereth Deep Survey Corridor, and our transit drive needed a recalibration halfway through." She looked past me at the corridor behind, at the emergency lighting, at the scorch marks on the wall where a conduit had blown. "How many wounded do you have?" 1,106 at last count. Some have died since." She nodded as if I had told her the weather. "Critical cases." 281, approximately. "Can I see your triage setup?" I took her to the hangar. She walked the rows without speaking. She stopped at several pallets, crouched, looked at wounds, looked at the improvised dressings and the hull sealant adhesive and the ration stock blood expanders. She did not wince. She did not look shocked. She looked the way a person looks when they are making a list in their head, and the list is long, and they are deciding where to start. When she had walked the entire bay, she came back to me. "All right," she said. "I have 2 medics and a trauma nurse. We have a field surgery kit rated for 60 patients. I have broad-spectrum coagulant, plasma expanders, analgesics, wound closure strips, and about 200 liters of saline. It is not enough for 1,100 people, but it is enough to start with the critical cases and work down." She looked at her datapad. "Your life support situation, how long do you have?" 5 days, perhaps 6. "We carry supplemental atmosphere canisters for survey site pressurization. I can transfer 12 to your ships. That buys you another 3 days, maybe 4. Water, we can run our purification system at full output and transfer to your tanks. Food," she paused. "We have survey rations. They are not good, but there are a lot of them." I stared at her. I had spent 6 days transmitting to a galaxy that had classified my people as a legal abstraction, and this woman, this civilian, this survey ship captain from a species my Navy had never bothered to catalog, was standing in front of me with a list. "You understand," I said, "that the Inner Accord has designated us as hostile remnants. Non-intervention Order 1174. Any vessel that renders aid to us is in violation of." "I read the order," she said. "Earth is not an Accord signatory. The Conclave may. We are not a Conclave member either." She said this the way someone says the sky is blue, a fact so obvious it did not require emphasis. She was not defiant. She was not making a political statement. She was simply outside the system that had decided we did not deserve to live, and she did not appear to find that position complicated. "Captain Vasic," I said, "why did you come?" She looked at me, brown eyes steady. "You sent a distress signal," she said. "We were close enough to hear it." That was the answer, the entire answer. She did not say she felt obligated. She did not say Earth had a policy. She did not invoke morality or principle or interstellar law. She heard us. She came. The way you pick up a comm when it rings and the voice on the other end says they need help. It was that simple, and I did not know what to do with how simple it was, because nothing in 6 days of silence had been simple, and nothing in 23 years of hegemonic military service had prepared me for someone who heard a signal and came because that was what you did when you heard a signal. Vasic's crew began work within the hour. 22 people. I want you to understand what that means. 22 humans, across 4 damaged warships carrying 2,200 Theran, 1,100 of them wounded. They worked in teams of 2 and 3. The 2 medics, a man named Akafer and a woman named Shane, went to the Resolve's hangar bay and began triaging the critical cases. The trauma nurse, whose name was Hadley, went to the Pale Vigil, which had the 2nd largest concentration of wounded. Vasic sent her engineer, a man named Kavak, to the Stillwater to assess the life support situation. She sent her atmospheric technician to the ninth threshold with 4 supplemental canisters. They brought their own equipment across in the Harwell's utility launches: cases of medical supplies, atmospheric modules, water purification cartridges, portable heating units, tool kits, diagnostic equipment that Kavek strapped to a hand trolley, and wrestled through our docking collar with the focused determination of a man who had moved heavy equipment through bad corridors before. I watched them unload, and what struck me was not the volume of supplies. It was modest, appropriate to a 22-person survey vessel, but the organization. Everything was labeled. Everything was packed for rapid deployment. The medical cases had color-coded compartments. The atmospheric canisters had quick-connect fittings. These were not emergency supplies that someone had thrown together. They were standard loadout. This ship was always prepared to help someone. It was part of the equipment list, the same way core drills and spectrographic analyzers were part of the equipment list. I watched Akefu work. He was the first human I had ever seen perform surgery, and I understood within 10 minutes why subsurgeon Eilith Vaughn stopped what she was doing and simply watched him for a full 60 seconds before going back to her own patients. His hands were not faster than hers. They were not steadier, but there was something in the way he moved, a fluency, a confidence that was not arrogance but practice. He had done this before. Not in a hangar bay on a wrecked warship, perhaps, but in places that were bad enough. He had a way of speaking to the patients while he worked. He could not speak Theran. They could not speak his language. But he spoke anyway, a low, steady voice, the tone of someone who wanted you to know that someone was there, even if you could not understand the words. Several of my officers later told me that they remembered his voice more than the procedures, that the sound of it was the first indication they had that someone outside the debris corridor knew they were alive. Shane worked differently, quieter, more deliberate, her focus narrow and absolute. She had a method with the worst cases that Eilith Vaughn described to me later as architectural. She did not simply treat the wound. She assessed the patient's entire physiological state, identified the 3 most critical systems in decline, and addressed them in sequence. She asked Eilith Vaughn about Theran vascular structure using a hand-drawn diagram on the back of a supply manifest. Eilith Vaughn drew the corrections, and Shane studied them for 30 seconds, nodded once, and adjusted her technique for every subsequent patient. 30 seconds. That was all she needed to recalibrate her approach for an entirely alien anatomy. Eilith Vaughn came to me after the first 4 hours and said, "Fleet Commander, the human medic has techniques I have not seen. His coagulation protocol uses a layered application that reduces blood loss by approximately. I do not know the percentage, but it is significant. With your permission, I would like to observe and adapt his methods for our remaining patients." I said yes. What I did not say, because she did not need to hear it, was that the fact she was asking, the fact that a Theran subsurgeon was requesting permission to learn from a human medic on a civilian survey ship, was the single most disorienting moment of my career. Not because it was humiliating, because it was not. It should have been, by every standard I had been trained to hold. A senior medical officer of the Theran hegemonic navy asking to study the techniques of a medic from a species we had never catalogued. But Eilith Vaughn's face when she asked was not ashamed. It was focused. She was a doctor. He had better tools and better methods. The question of species did not enter her calculation, and I realized in that moment that the hegemony's calculation, the one that had placed Earth in a category too small to notice, had been wrong in a way that had nothing to do with military intelligence and everything to do with a kind of blindness we had cultivated so carefully that we mistook it for clarity. Vasek's crew worked for 31 hours without stopping. I know this because I was awake for all of it, and so was Vale Keth, and so were the dozen or so of my officers who were ambulatory enough to help. The humans did not ask for help. They did not need to. My people saw what was happening and went where they could be useful, carrying supplies, clearing corridors for stretcher access, helping Kavak's team reroute power conduits on the Stillwater when its secondary life support grid began to fail. Kavak brought the Stillwater's life support back from the edge in 14 hours. He replaced 4 filter modules with components he had fabricated on the Harwell's machine shop, a small lathe and a material printer that were designed for making survey equipment parts, and had never, I suspect, been used to manufacture atmospheric filtration components for an alien warship. But Kavak looked at the specifications, looked at the materials he had, and made the parts. They did not fit perfectly. He shimmed them with strips of hull sealant compound and a thermal adhesive that smelled of something sharp and chemical. They held. They are still holding, as far as I know, aboard a ship that sits empty in the Karathsev corridor. Working parts made by a human engineer from a survey ship, fitted into an alien warship's life support grid with shimming compound, keeping the air clean in a vessel that no one will ever board again. At one point, it was early in the second day, I think, perhaps 0400, I found Vasek sitting in the corridor outside the hangar with her back against the wall, eating something from a sealed packet. She looked exhausted. The lines on her face had deepened. She was drinking water from a bottle that was almost empty. I sat down across from her. My leg hurt. My hand hurt. Everything hurt, but the hurting had become so constant it was almost a texture, like the hum of a ship's drive, something you stopped hearing because it never stopped. "Your crew has been working continuously," I said. "They are used to it," she said. "Survey work is long hours. This is different, but the endurance is the same." "How long can you sustain this?" She chewed, swallowed. "As long as it takes. We have enough supplies to stabilize your critical patients and keep your life support running for another 8 to 10 days. Beyond that, I have been in contact with Earth." I looked at her. "I transmitted a situation report to the Earth Relief Authority 12 hours ago," she said. "They are not fast. Earth's humanitarian infrastructure is, I will be honest, not large. We are a young species in this part of the galaxy, but they have assets. A relief way station at Varath 3 on the far side of the transit corridor. It is not a military installation, it is a humanitarian processing facility. Refugee intake, medical, housing. It was built 3 years ago for a different situation, but it has capacity." She folded the empty packet and put it in her pocket. "I have requested asylum authorization for your people, all 2,200. I said nothing. I did not know what to say. Asylum was a word I understood in the abstract, a legal concept, a mechanism in accord refugee law that the hegemony had voted against expanding on 4 separate occasions. We had argued that asylum provisions were abused by economic migrants masquerading as displaced persons. We had argued that the Accord's refugee quota system was sufficient. We had argued. I had sat in the gallery during one of those votes, when I was a junior officer attending a diplomatic rotation, and I had watched the hegemony's delegate cast our vote against expansion, with the smooth confidence of someone who knew that the Theron would never need to use the provision they were blocking. And now this woman, this civilian, was filing for it on our behalf with a government that had no reason to grant it. "You understand that we are military personnel," I said. "The order classifies us as—" "The order classifies you as something you are not," she said. She did not raise her voice. She did not look angry. She looked tired and certain. "You are people on ships that are failing. You have wounded who are dying. You have no government to return to and no port that will take you. The fact that you wore a uniform when the world fell apart does not change what you are now, which is people who need help." She stood up. "I have to get back to the Pale Vigil. Hadley is reporting a decompression risk in the lower decks, and we need to get 70 patients moved before the section is sealed." She left. I sat in the corridor for a while. The steady dim light hummed above me. I could hear, faintly, the sound of her boots on the deck plating, moving away, moving toward the next thing that needed doing. On the 3rd day of the human's presence, the 9th day since the battle, a transmission arrived from the Earth Relief Authority. Valeketh brought it to me on the bridge. It was addressed to Captain Vasic, with a copy to Fleet Commander Sora Thar, Theron 3rd Expeditionary, retired. The word retired was not accurate, but it was kinder than remnant, and I noticed that. The document was 4 pages. I read it in full. The Earth Relief Authority, acting under the Emergency Humanitarian Response Act of 2031, a piece of human domestic legislation I had never heard of, had authorized the intake of up to 3,000 displaced persons of Theran origin at Way Station Verath 3. The authorization was unconditional. No requirement of political allegiance. No requirement of disarmament, though the document noted that weapons would be stored and secured upon arrival, not confiscated. No requirement to renounce Theran citizenship, a formality that was meaningless anyway since the citizenship no longer existed. No time limit. No conditions of departure. The document used the word asylum 4 times and the word sanctuary once, and I read it standing on the bridge of a ship that belonged to a nation that no longer existed, in a corridor of debris that no one in the galaxy had come to clear, and I felt something I had not felt in 9 days. It was not hope. Hope is too clean a word for it. It was the feeling of a door opening in a wall you had come to believe was solid. Not a large door, not a grand one, but a door, and through it light. And the light was not dramatic or golden or cinematic. It was the ordinary light of a facility that had been built to receive people and was ready to receive them. I called Vasic to the bridge. "I have read the authorization," I said. "Good," she said. "I want to understand the terms." "There are no terms," she said. "Your people come, they are housed, they are fed, they receive medical care, they stay as long as they need to. When they are ready, if they are ever ready, they decide for themselves what comes next. And in return," she looked at me the way she had looked at me 6 days earlier, when I had asked her why she came. The same brown eyes, the same steadiness. "Nothing," she said. "This is not a transaction, Fleet Commander. I want to tell you that I received this with grace. I want to tell you that I stood on my bridge, wounded and ash pale and commanding the wreckage of a dead fleet, and accepted this woman's unconditional mercy with the dignity of a Theran officer. But I did not. What I did was turn away from her, toward the viewport, and look out at the debris corridor, the floating wreckage of my ships, the cold metal of everything I had lost. And I pressed my hand against the glass and I breathed, and the breathing was not steady, and the hand was not steady, and the glass was cold. And for a moment I was not a fleet commander. I was a person who had spent 9 days watching her people die in a galaxy that had decided they did not count, and someone had just told her that they counted. Vasic did not say anything. She stood behind me and she waited, and when I turned back she was still there and her face was the same, and she did not mention what she had seen. That, too, was a kindness, the kind that does not announce itself. The evacuation took 4 days. Vasic coordinated it with a methodical precision that I recognized from my own training, the way a competent officer breaks an impossible task into a sequence of possible ones, and then does them in order. The 9th threshold, as the least damaged vessel, was the first to be emptied. Vasic's crew transferred its 312 occupants to the Harwell in groups of 40, shuttling them across in the Harwell's 2 utility launches. The launches were not designed for passenger transport. They were designed for moving equipment and core samples. Vasic's crew had stripped the cargo restraints and lined the decks with thermal blankets and portable heating units so that the wounded could lie flat during the transit. Each crossing took 90 minutes. Between crossings, Vasic's crew cleaned the launches, restocked the heating units, and prepared for the next group. I asked Vasic where she was putting 300 people on a ship that housed 22. "We cleared the survey lab, the sample storage bay, and the secondary cargo hold," she said. "My crew is bunking in the engine room and the bridge corridor. We have enough floor space for 300 if they do not mind being close together. And they will not stay long. The transit to Verath 3 is 11 days. It will not be comfortable, but everyone will have air, water, and food. Your own supplies. We rationed from the moment we arrived. My crew agreed unanimously. She glanced at her datapad. We will be thin by the time we reach Verath 3, but we will not be hungry. Survey crews are used to stretching supplies. It is part of the job. I thought about that. 22 people who had voluntarily rationed their own food to feed 2,200 strangers. People from a species they had never met, serving a nation that no longer existed, carrying a legal classification that the galaxy's largest diplomatic body had specifically designed to prevent anyone from helping them. And they had rationed their food. Not because they were ordered to, because they agreed. The Stillwater was emptied next. Then the Pale Vigil. The Resolve was last because it was the largest and because the wounded in the hangar required the most careful handling. Ilith Vaughn supervised the medical transfers, working alongside Akafor and Shane, with a coordination that would have seemed impossible 9 days earlier. A Theran subsurgeon and 2 human medics, communicating through a mix of pigeon gestures and a translation device that Vasic's communications officer had rigged from a survey band linguistic database and a commercial translation module that was designed for trade negotiations and struggled with medical terminology. They made it work. Ilith Vaughn told me later that she and Akafor had developed a system of hand signals for the most common procedures: 2 fingers raised for coagulant, a flat palm for analgesic, a closed fist for plasma expander. It was not elegant, she said, but it was precise. And in medicine, precision matters more than elegance. The last of the Theran to leave the Resolve were the dead. I had given the order to leave them where they lay on the first day, and they had lain there since, in the compartments where they had fallen, in the corridors they had been carried to, in the makeshift spaces where their bodies had been gathered by crewmates who could not bear to leave them alone but could not spare the hands to move them further. Vasic's crew offered to help with the transfer. They did not have to be asked. A man named Tors and a woman named Kaio spent 11 hours moving Theran dead from the Resolve to the Harwell's lower cargo bay, which Vasic had designated as a mortuary space. They wrapped each body in thermal sheeting. They recorded each name from the identity tags. They worked in silence. I went to the cargo bay after the last body was aboard. There were 147 of them. Tors and Kaio were standing near the door, and they looked the way people look after 11 hours of handling the dead hollowed out, the kind of tired that is not physical but goes to the center of who you are. I nodded to them. Tors nodded back. Kaio said something in her own language, very quiet, almost under her breath, and I did not need the translation device to know that it was for the dead. You can hear that tone in any language. We left the 4 ships in the Karath Sev debris corridor. I stood on the Harwell's bridge, a small, cluttered space that smelled of coffee and metal and sweat, and watched through the viewport as the Ascendant Resolve fell behind. She was dark except for the emergency markers that would pulse for another 30 days before the batteries died. Her hull was scorched and breached in 11 places. She had been the flagship of a fleet, and before that, she had been the flagship of a doctrine, and before that, she had been the flagship of a certainty. The certainty that the Theran hegemony was permanent, that our place in the order of things was fixed, that the calculations we had made about who mattered and who did not were correct. She hung in the dark now, a monument to every one of those certainties, and she was wrong, and she was empty, and she was beautiful in the way that broken things are beautiful when you are leaving them behind. The transit to Verath 3 took 11 days. I will not describe them in detail because the details are small and domestic and they do not have the shape of a story. They have the shape of a life: people eating, people sleeping, people changing bandages, people sitting in corridors that were too crowded and talking in low voices about what they had lost and what they did not know. Children, there were 9 children aboard, dependents of officers who had been stationed on the Resolve at the time of the battle. playing a game with packing material in the cleared survey lab, while Theron adults watched them and tried to remember what it felt like to believe that tomorrow was a thing that would come. On the third day of transit, one of the children, a girl of perhaps 6, the daughter of a weapons officer who had died in the first wave, found Vasek's navigation charts on a console in the survey lab and began drawing on the back of one with a marker she had found somewhere. She drew a ship. It was not a good drawing. It was the kind of drawing a 6-year-old makes, a rectangle with circles for engines, and a triangle on top that might have been a bridge or might have been a hat. But she drew it with the serious concentration of someone who was making something important, and when Vasek saw it, she did not take the chart back. She pulled another chart from the shelf, blank on the reverse, and put it next to the first one, and the girl drew another ship, and then another, until the floor of the survey lab was covered in drawings of ships, and the girl was sitting in the middle of them like someone who had rebuilt a fleet from paper. I heard about this secondhand. When I went to see for myself, the girl was asleep on the lab floor, curled on a thermal blanket with the marker still in her hand. Vasek had put a folded coverall under her head as a pillow. Vasek's crew moved among us during those 11 days. They did not hover. They did not perform. They brought food, checked equipment, monitored life support, and went about the work of running a ship that was carrying 10 times its intended complement through a transit corridor that no one was patrolling. At meals, if you could call them meals, ration packs eaten standing in corridors or sitting on deck plating, the humans ate the same food we did. I mentioned this to Vasek once, and she looked at me as though I had said something odd. "We are all on the same ship," she said. That was the end of the conversation. On the 5th day, Eilifvan reported that no further patients had died since boarding the Harwell. Every critical case had been stabilized. The blood volume expanders that Akafar had brought, proper medical-grade ones, not the ration stock substitutes Eilifvan had been synthesizing, had been the difference. She estimated that 14 of the patients she had classified as terminal on the Resolve were now expected to survive. 14 lives that had been over, that were now continuing, because a survey ship carried blood volume expanders as part of its standard loadout. I asked Eilifvan how a survey ship came to carry surgical supplies, rated for mass casualty response. She had asked Akafar the same question. His answer, she told me, was that Earth's survey vessels were often the first human presence in uncharted sectors, and uncharted sectors had a tendency to contain people who needed help. The medical kit was not an afterthought. It was a design requirement. On the 8th day of transit, I was sitting in the corridor outside the bridge, the only quiet spot on the ship, because the bridge crew kept the corridor clear for emergency access, and Kavak, the engineer, sat down beside me. He had been working on the Harwell's water reclamation system, which was running at 300% of its rated capacity and making a sound that he described as deeply unhappy. "How is your leg?" he asked. "Functional." "Shane said you have not let her look at it since the 2nd day." "It is functional," I repeated. He nodded. He had a cup of something hot, not coffee, something darker, something that smelled of earth and grain. He drank from it. "Fleet Commander," he said, "can I ask you something?" "Yes." "When we arrived, when the captain first came aboard your ship, you asked her why we came. Do you remember?" "I remember." "Did the answer make sense to you?" I looked at him. He was a large man with a broad face and hands that were permanently stained with something, lubricant, perhaps, or coolant residue. He did not look like a diplomat or a philosopher. He looked like what he was, a man who kept engines running. "No," I said. "It did not." He nodded again slowly as if this was the answer he had expected. "It does not make sense to a lot of people the first time they hear it," he said. "I think that is because it is too simple. People expect a complicated reason, a policy, a treaty, a calculation, but there is not one. Someone calls for help. You are close enough to hear it. You go." He sipped his drink. That is it. Your species does this often. He thought about it. Often enough, he said. Not always. We are not saints, Fleet Commander. We have our own history of looking away. But when we do come, when someone decides to answer the call, we tend to bring what we have. All of it. He finished his drink, stood up, patted the corridor wall the way a man pats a horse, and went back to the water reclamation system that was deeply unhappy. Verath 3 appeared on the long-range display on the morning of the 11th day. It was a station, not a planet, a modular facility in orbit around a brown dwarf that had no name, only a survey catalog number. The station was newer than I had expected. Its hull was clean. Its docking arrays were lit. As we approached, I could see through the bridge viewport that the station's main receiving bay was open. A wide, illuminated space large enough to take the Harwell whole, with guide lights blinking along the approach corridor. There were people standing in the bay. I could see them through the viewport as Vasek brought the Harwell in on manual approach. Humans, perhaps 60 of them, standing in rows near the docking clamps, wearing the same blue coveralls as Vasek's crew but with different patches: medical, logistics, facilities management. One of them held a datapad. Several held thermal blankets. One of them, a tall woman near the front, held nothing. She simply stood and waited, the way you wait for someone you have been told is coming and you are ready for. The Harwell docked at 0814. Vasek's crew opened the main hatch, and the air that came in from the station was clean and warm and smelled of nothing. Not smoke, not metal, not hull sealant, not blood. It smelled of nothing, and that nothing was the most remarkable thing I had experienced in 20 days, because for 20 days every breath I had taken had carried the scent of damage, and this air carried no damage at all. The tall woman at the front of the welcoming party was named Director Anara Foltz. She shook my hand, a human gesture that Valeketh had briefed me on during the transit, and said, "Fleet Commander, welcome to Verath 3. Your people are expected and your quarters are prepared. Medical teams are standing by for your wounded. There is no rush. Take as long as you need." There is no rush. Take as long as you need. 14 words. I have turned them over in my mind many times since, and I still find that they carry more weight than the 4-page asylum authorization. Because the authorization was a document, a legal instrument necessary and binding. But those 14 words were a person standing in a doorway and saying, "Come in, sit down, rest. The door will still be open tomorrow." The disembarkation took 6 hours. The wounded went first, carried on stretchers by human medical teams who moved with the same quiet competence I had seen in Akafor and Shane. The station's medical wing was larger than I had anticipated. A full ward with individual bays, diagnostic equipment I did not recognize, and a staff of 11 physicians and 22 nurses. They had prepared for us. The beds had been adjusted for Theran physiology, longer frames, firmer surfaces, the overhead lighting tuned to a spectral range that Eilith von later told me was almost exactly calibrated to the therapeutic wavelength used in Theran convalescent facilities. Someone had researched this. Someone had looked up what our wounded needed and had set the lights accordingly before we arrived. The ambulatory followed. Then the children. The girl who had drawn the ships carried her stack of navigation chart drawings with her. No one asked her to leave them behind. Valeketh organized the disembarkation with the quiet efficiency that was the only thing either of us still knew how to give. She matched each officer, each family, each wounded patient to a receiving team at the docking bay. She kept a count. She kept a list. She did the work of a logistics officer for a fleet that no longer existed, and she did it perfectly because that was what she was, and the fact that the structure she served had collapsed did not change the quality of the work. The dead were last. Director Foltz had prepared a designated space, a cool, quiet room with amber lighting that she told me was adjustable to whatever spectral range was appropriate for Theran funeral customs. I did not know if she had researched Theron funeral customs, or simply guessed that we would need a room like that. I did not ask. When the last of the Theron were off the Harwell, I went back aboard. The ship was empty now, empty in the way that a house is empty after the family has left. The corridors were scuffed. The survey lab smelled of 2,000 people who had lived in it for 11 days. The cargo bay where Tors and Kaio had laid our dead was clean. They had cleaned it. Vasek was on the bridge, running post-docking diagnostics. Her crew moved around her in the quiet, efficient rhythm of people returning to a routine they knew by heart. Kavak was in the engine room. Akafor and Shane were stowing the medical kits. The ship was becoming itself again, a survey tender, a work vessel, a tool for looking at rocks and mapping corridors, and doing the unremarkable work that had brought it to the Karath-Sev sector in the first place. "Captain Vasek," I said from the doorway. She turned, "Fleet Commander." I stopped. I had rehearsed this. I had spent 3 days composing what I would say to this woman when the moment came, and I had drafted and discarded a dozen versions, and every one of them had been inadequate, because the language I had been trained in, the formal Theron military register of gratitude, with its structured phrases and its ranked acknowledgments, was designed for a world where debts were calculated and repaid, and what this woman had done was not a debt. It was not a transaction. She had told me so herself, and I had not understood it at the time, and I was not certain I understood it now, but I knew that the words I had prepared were the wrong ones. "Thank you," I said, 2 words. Human words, not Theron ones, spoken in her language, which I had learned from Kavak in the corridor on the 8th day of transit. I did not say them well. The vowels were wrong and the stress was in the wrong place, and I saw Vasek's mouth move, not a smile exactly, but a movement that was near one. "You are welcome," she said. "What will you do now?" I asked. "Resume our survey route. We are 4 weeks behind schedule. There is a mineral survey in the Verath Deep Corridor that Earth's Geological Service has been waiting for, and they are not patient people." She looked at her console. "We should be underway within the hour." "Within the hour," I repeated. "Yes." "No ceremony." She looked at me again, the brown eyes, the steadiness. The face of a woman who had given 20 days of her life, and her crew's life, and her ship's supplies to 2,200 strangers, and who was now going back to looking at rocks. "No ceremony," she said. "We have work." I left the Harwell. I walked through the docking collar into the station, and the hatch sealed behind me, and I stood in the corridor of Verath 3 and listened to the muffled clang of the docking clamps releasing, and then the low hum of the Harwell's drive spinning up, and then nothing. I went to the observation gallery on the station's upper ring. It was a long, quiet room with a curved viewport that looked out into the brown dwarf's amber light. I stood at the glass and watched the Harwell pull away from the station, orient itself, and accelerate toward the transit corridor. It took about 4 minutes. At the end of 4 minutes, it was a point of light, and then it was not even that. 22 people. A survey tender with a dent in its port quarter, 4 weeks behind schedule and heading for a mineral survey that someone on Earth was waiting for. That was all. That was the entire rescue. Not a fleet, not an armada, not a political statement or a diplomatic gambit or a calculated exercise in galactic influence. A ship that heard a signal, a crew that came, a captain who said, "This is not a transaction." I stood at the glass for a long time after the Harwell was gone. The station hummed around me. Somewhere below, my people were being fed, housed, treated, received. Somewhere below, Eilith Vaughn was showing Akafor's layered coagulation technique to the station's medical staff. Somewhere below, 9 children were sleeping in beds for the first time in 20 days. Somewhere below, 147 of our dead lay in a room with amber lighting, attended and quiet. The Theron hegemony is gone. I will likely never hold a rank again, and I am learning slowly, with difficulty, that this does not mean I have lost who I am. I am learning this in a facility built by a species my government never catalogued, on a station orbiting a star with no name, eating food that does not taste like ours and sleeping in quarters that were designed for different bodies and doing, every day, the work of figuring out what a person is when the structure that defined them has collapsed, and the ground they stand on was built by strangers who asked for nothing. The Accord has not contacted us. The Conclave has not contacted us. The galaxy, as far as I can determine, has not noticed that 2,200 Theran souls are living on a human way station in the outer transit corridor, and I am not certain the galaxy will notice, and I am less certain than I used to be that the galaxy's notice matters. The ECS Harwell filed its after-action report with the Earth Relief Authority 41 days after departing Verath 3. I obtained a copy through Director Foltz, who told me it had been classified as routine. The report was 11 pages long. It listed the supplies expended, the medical procedures performed, the atmospheric canisters transferred, the transit route, and the fuel cost. It did not list the lives saved. It did not list the dead we carried. It did not mention the word asylum or the word mercy or the word sacrifice. It read like what it was, a survey ship's log of an unscheduled stop. On the last page, in the section marked additional notes, Captain Vasek had written one line. Responded to distress signal in Karathsev corridor, rendered assistance, resumed survey route. That was all, 12 words, and I think, when the historians of whatever comes after the hegemony try to explain what happened to us, how a shattered military caste found its way to a place it did not know existed, given refuge by a species it had never spoken to, and allowed to grieve and to heal and to begin again without condition and without cost, I think those 12 words will be the only ones that matter. She heard us, she came, she helped, she left. I keep Vasek's report in a drawer in my quarters at Verath 3. I read it once a week, not because I need to remember what it says, but because I need to remember what it does not say. It does not say why. It does not say what Earth expects. It does not say what comes next.